Please stand for the Gospel. It's a reading from Matthew's Gospel. Jesus said to his disciples, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes his sun to rise on the bad and the good, and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? Do not the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brothers and sisters only, what's unusual about that? Do not the pagans do the same? So be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect." Words inspired by God. My mother, Peg, had a great sense of humour. Many of you knew her. She visited us several times. And she was a great storyteller as well. But she was a storyteller in a very different genre from her own father, my grandfather, Daddy Jim. Daddy Jim was a storyteller in the ancient Irish sense of the Shanachri, the village, storyteller. And he had these great epic folklores and myths from a way, way back in prehistoric times. So he would tell me stories about, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people who were in Ireland long before the Celts arrived. And he'd tell me stories about Cuchulainn and the Red Branch Knights. And he'd tell me great sagas about Fionn McCool and the Fianna, and about Niamh Cian Óir, Niamh of the Golden Hair. So his storytelling was of the epic proportion. Peg was a very different kind of a storyteller. Peg was much more in the genre of Jerry Seinfeld. Peg could take ordinary incidents from the day and in telling them would sound hilarious. And she could laugh at herself constantly about the faux pas that she made. I'll give you an example. She had, for the last about 10 years, her car was a little red Ford Fiesta. I don't know if we even have them in the States. They're very small little cars, four-door little cars, made by Ford, obviously. And she had this little red Ford Fiesta. And she lived in a suburb of Cork, which was called Douglas. And there was a big shopping centre about a mile away from her, called the Douglas Shopping Centre. And there was all different kinds of shops. There were shoe shops and restaurants and a big grocery store there. And every Saturday, she'd drive her little Ford Fiesta down there, and there's this huge big parking lot, maybe 500 or 600 cars there. And she'd get a trolley, go into the grocery store, do her shopping, and she'd load it up with maybe 8 or 9 bags of groceries because she liked to feed everybody. And this particular Saturday, she goes down there about 11 o'clock in the morning, and she gets the trolley, and she wheels it into the equivalent of Safeway, and she does her shopping. She's 8 or 9 bags of groceries, and then she comes out, and she's wheeling it across the parking lot, and she opens up the trunk of her car. In Ireland, we call it the boot. So she opens up the boot, and she offloads her 10 bags of groceries, closes it down, and then wheels the trolley back to the bay, and it comes back in, and opens the driver's side and sits into the driver's side. Now, in Ireland, we drive at the other side. So she's on the right-hand side of the car, and she looks to the left, and there's this old man sitting in the left looking at her. And she thinks, oh my God, this poor guy is demented. He doesn't know where he is. So she looks and she says, what are you doing here? And he says, I'm waiting for my wife, ma'am. And Peg says, and where's your wife? She's inside grocery shopping, ma'am. And Peg thinks the poor guy is lost. So she says, should the two of us go in and find her? And he says, no, ma'am. She told me to sit here in the car and wait for her. And Peg says, she told you to sit in my car? And he says, no, ma'am, this is my wife's car. And Peg suddenly realizes she's sitting in the wrong red Fiesta. So she just cracks up, gets out of the car, goes back to the trunk, opens it up, goes and gets a trolley, brings the trolley back, offloads all her groceries, closes down the trunk, apologizes again to the old man in the front seat, and then runs around the parking lot looking for her own red Fiesta, finally finds it, opens up the trunk, offloads her groceries, closes it back down, gives back the trolley, and then sits into her car and comes home and tells the whole neighbourhood about what's happened to her. So she could make this brilliant story about a small little incident and crack up in the process. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that today as we get into Lent. The idea of forgetting and paying attention. And basically, I'm going to make 5 very short little points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to differentiate between forgetting and attention, memory and attention. And then secondly, I'm going to look at the dance between consciousness and the subconscious. And then I'm going to talk about Lent and the importance of Lent and not forgetting what Lent is about. Fourthly, I'm going to talk about prejudices and phobias. And then fifthly, a quick notion of feedback loops. So that's basically what I'll talk about this morning. So very, very often, when we can't find something, it's not because our memory is bad, it's because our attention is pathetic. A lot of the times, it's not that we forget where we left stuff, it's that we weren't paying attention in the first place when we put stuff there. So how often have you gone around the house saying, did anybody see my glasses? Where the hell did I put my car keys? So it's not actually that you forgot where you put them, it's that you weren't paying any attention when you put them down. It never even made it into your short-term memory because you were distracted and you were not paying attention. I remember at one stage, I had an aunt of mine called Rita, my father's sister. And my father, Paddy, was staying with Rita at one stage for a weekend. And Rita was totally out of it completely. Had no idea what she was doing most of the time. So at one stage, she's upstairs and she calls out to my father, Paddy, did you see my false teeth? And Paddy says, top ones or bottom ones? She says, both. He's looking around. He says, did you have them when we were having breakfast? And she says, have a look on the table and see that I leave them on the table downstairs. So Paddy looks around and there's no sign of her false teeth. So she comes down the stairs and she says, oh my God, did I throw them into the trash? So they take the trash and they go through all of the trash and there's no sign of the false teeth. So she's tearing her hair out. Oh my God almighty, what did I do with them? About an hour later, my father goes to the bathroom, and as he goes to the bathroom, he sees the false teeth sitting inside in the sink. So it wasn't that she forgot where she put them, it was she wasn't paying attention in the first place. It never even made it into short-term memory. And I do the same thing myself constantly. About once a month, I drive down to Santa Rosa to Costco to do shopping. And every time I go down there, I get lost. Because when I'm going down there, I'm listening to podcasts and I'm not paying any attention to the road and I inevitably get lost. And then it takes me 20 minutes longer to actually get to Costco than it should have. And you'd imagine the next time I go down, I'd have learned my lesson, but I don't. I'm listening to podcasts again on the way down and I get lost the next time. So it's not like I can't remember where Costco is. It's that I never figured out where it was in the first place. I've never paid attention to where Costco is. So inevitably, at some stage of every journey, I have to pull off the freeway 101, go into my GPS, plug in Costco, and then follow the directions. But the next time I think, I'll get it this time. I won't forget it this time. But because I wasn't paying attention, I was just listening to the GPS, I get lost the next time as well. So I have this ritual of pulling off to the side of 101 and plugging in the address of Costco and then proceeding. So a lot of stuff that we think we're forgetting, we're not actually forgetting. We're just not paying attention. We're terrible at paying attention. Which brings me to my second point, the dance of consciousness and the subconscious. Buddhism takes this so seriously that they created a whole kind of meditation to try to help us to be more aware more frequently. They call it mindfulness meditation. And it's very, very different from other forms of meditation. Typically, when we're meditating, we're told just you want to clear your mind completely. Think about nothing. Or focus on something, like a candle flame or a mantra. But mindfulness meditation is very different. It asks you to attend to everything that you're experiencing momentarily. Not hang on to anything, but pay attention. So in a mindfulness meditation, if a thought comes up, you'll say, oh, that's a thought. If you have an itch in your right leg, you think, oh, an itch in my right leg. If you're feeling somehow sad, you say, oh, an emotion. So you just tag everything that comes up but you don't get invested in it. And the image I use for this kind of meditation is, imagine you're sitting in a long, 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 narrow room, and it's totally dark, and there's just one window in the room. At the very, very end is a small framed window, and you're sitting at the back wall watching down at this window. And there's a circus passing by, and now you can see an elephant trundling by, and now there's a cage full of monkeys, and then come the lions, and then come the clowns, and as they engage the frame of the window, you pay attention to it, you tag it, say lions, elephants, clowns, whatever, and let it go. You resist the temptation of running up the room and sticking your head out through the window to see what happened to the lions. So mindfulness meditation is just tagging everything, bringing it to awareness, but not getting invested in it. But there's a real balance to be struck between what you can hold in awareness and what you need to give to the subconscious. Remember when you were learning to drive a car for the first time, and it was really, overpowering. You had to remember, where was the clutch, where was the brake, where was the accelerator, where was the gear lever, what was first, what was second, what was reverse, steering at the same time, watching your internal mirror and your external mirrors, and it was real overload. But after a while, you did it so well that you could now delegate it to the subconscious. You didn't have to be thinking about any of those things. In fact, now when you're driving your car, you could be holding conversations, you could be making phone calls, even though it's illegal, you could be texting, even if that's illegal. You can do all those things at the same time because you've delegated a whole bunch of stuff to the subconscious. So there's this balance between bringing stuff to consciousness, and putting stuff in the unconscious. You have 70 trillion cells in your body. You can't be aware all the time of what each one of these is doing. You go crazy. You look at, for instance, you have to remember to breathe about 18 times every minute. You have to remember to beat your heart about 72 times every minute. You have to remember to blink about 10 times every minute. If you had to do all of that consciously, you'd be totally overloaded. And so you have to repress a lot of this stuff and kind of program it into the subconscious. But sometimes the subconscious forgets its tasks. So I remember my father had dementia for the last 8 or 9 years of his life. And I remember on one occasion, deciding to take him out for a drive in the car. So I go to his house, I opened the passenger side door and I said, let's go for a drive, Dad. And he couldn't figure out how to get into the car. He literally could not figure out how to get into the passenger side and sit down. And when you think about it, that simple action is actually really, really complicated. The first thing you have to do is you have to learn how to squat a little bit, get your head down. Then you got to lift. In Ireland, the passenger will be on the left-hand side. So you have to lift your right leg and push it in. You're balancing on your left leg. You're crouching down. You're trying to catch onto the handle of the door. You're trying to lift yourself down. It's actually really, really complicated. Kids spent months learning this technique. He couldn't remember how to do it. I had to literally go around and lift up his right leg, put it in, put his head down, push him in, lower him onto the seat, pick up his left leg and put it in after him. And so very, very often, we have to put stuff into the unconscious. We have to create kind of muscle memory. But at some stages, even the muscle memory gives up. And so, for instance, some of them give up completely and others don't. Like, we never forget how to cough. We'll cough spontaneously. Or to sneeze. Or if you have an itch in your nose, to scratch it. Right up to the last minute, you won't forget those things. But you can forget how to swallow. And so a lot of people will develop pneumonia because the swallow muscles, the memory of swallowing is gone. And so they'll aspirate food and develop pneumonia. So it's a really, really complex balancing act between giving stuff to the unconscious and keeping stuff in full awareness. So what kind of stuff is so important that we really, really need to keep it in awareness? And I would mention 3 qualities. I think the first one is to never let go of a sense of awe and curiosity at life. To be totally awestruck by, as I look out here at the mountains around me and the forest around me and the sunshine and the clouds, to never give up on being awestruck by it. And the second quality, I think, would be gratitude. Gratitude for everything and everybody in my life. And the third one, I think, would be relationships. To never allow relationships or the quality of a relationship to sink into the subconscious or to the unconscious. And I'm thinking of three kinds of relationships particularly. The relationship to God, the relationship to others, and the relationship to nature. I think these are three elements that constantly need to be kept in full awareness. And I want to emphasize this morning, the awareness of our relationship to God. We're bite-sized bits of God. We are, souls on safari, spirits in spacesuits. We're the parts of God that have volunteered for incarnation. So it's so important for us to remember that. Which brings me to my third point, because Lent is a period of preparation for the great mystery of life, death, and resurrection. And so I want to just say a few things about Lent, and to bring us back many, many, many years into our childhood. Lent is really difficult, I believe, for two reasons. And the first one is that it's so difficult for little kids that we have to learn how to game Lent. I'm sure most of you came from a background where, you were told that during Lent, you had to give up something for Lent. So the adults gave up beer, or sugar or salt, and the kids gave up sweets, or candies. And that's really, really difficult. So somebody had figured out a way of gaming the system. Lent went on for 40 days. Now, I don't know if you gamed it the same way here as we did in Ireland, but in Ireland, if you were a kid and you gave up candy for Lent, you were allowed to eat candy every Sunday. So that was 6 days out of Lent that you were free to eat candy. And you could eat it on St. Patrick's Day. So if you were lucky and St. Patrick's Day didn't fall on a Sunday, unfortunately it does this year, if you were lucky and St. Patrick's Day did not fall on a Sunday, there were 7 days during Lent when you could pick out on candies. So we learned how to game the system in Ireland. I don't know if you did the same thing here on Sundays. So you got around the hardness of Lent, by gaming it a little bit. Now, the second problem was this, that Lent ended on midnight on Easter Saturday. And then the temptation was to really pick out at 1 minute after midnight. There'd be Easter eggs. And the Easter eggs were these big, big chocolate eggs, and they were hollow, and they'd be filled with candies, individual candies inside. And you'd break it open and gorge yourself on the Easter eggs and the candy inside. Now, here's the problem. If you gorge yourself at 1 minute past midnight on Easter Saturday, on Holy Saturday, you couldn't go to communion on Easter Sunday. Because the rule at that stage was you had to be fasting from midnight. So here was the dilemma. You've been off sweets for all of Lent. Lent is officially over, but you can't eat the candy because if you do, you can't go to communion next day. And if you come from a small little village and you don't go to communion, everybody notices. And goes, oh my God almighty. The only reason you can't go to communion is you committed a mortal sin since your last confession. So I wonder, what did that guy do? So there you are at 1 minute past midnight on Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday, wondering, will I or won't I? Can I eat the candy, and risk, my immortal soul, or can I kind of postpone it until after Mass? So it was really, really difficult. Lent was a really difficult time when you were a kid. Now, I remember my very first Lent in Palo Alto. So I came to Palo Alto on the 23rd of June in 1987. So my first Lent would have been in 1988. And I'm living in St. Albert's just down the road from where you're sitting right now. And I remember for some reason or other, I decided that for the homily that day, I would talk about what's important to give up. And I suggested to the congregation that day, it's not about giving up alcohol for Lent. And it's not about giving up cookies or candies for Lent. It's not about giving up salt for Lent. It's not about giving up, smoking for Lent. The most important thing you can give up for Lent is to give up a prejudice. Which brings me to my fourth point. What are prejudices about, and why is it so important to look at our prejudices? And I'm going to suggest actually, that psychologically speaking, prejudices and phobias are very, very connected. And typically, it seems to me that we have two kinds of prejudices. The first one are inherited prejudices. We're prejudiced because we've been taught by our parents. Let's say, for instance, there's a family feud. This bunch of the family is not talking to another bunch of the family because 3 generations ago there was some kind of a spat. So now we don't talk to them. So we inherit this as little kids with you. That's how life is. Or we inherit the prejudice of politics. In Ireland, there were two main parties. One was called Fianna Fáil and the other called Fine Gael. And you were born into one of these political families. And, the other guys were the enemies. No, you never examined the history behind it or understood pretty much the policies, but you believed if you were born into this family, you were Fianna Fáil, and you would never think of voting Fine Gael. If you were born into a Fine Gael family, you would never think of crossing the aisles and voting for Fianna Fáil. So there's one group of prejudices that we just inherit. We inherit because we're born Irish, or we inherit because we're born Catholic, or we inherit because we're born white, whatever it is. So we inherit a whole bunch of prejudices. And we rarely examine them because that's how things are. That's how life is. That's how we've been educated. The second kind of prejudices are ones that we've kind of made ourselves. And it always goes from generalizing from a specific encounter with a particular person to generalizing it to the whole class of people. So you have an encounter with an individual person whom you've never met before, and it gets off on a real bad footing. And now you generalize from that event and you paint an entire character for that person whom you don't know, and you're going to make all these presumptions about what else is wrong with this kind of person on the basis of one event, that went wrong for some reason. So you're going to generalize from a single event with this person and presume that's indicative of everything they are. Or you can generalize from a member of a particular group, like you have an encounter with somebody of a different colour or a different religious affiliation, and you have one encounter with one member of that, and you generalize it to everybody of that ilk. Now, in science, this is a terrible mistake to make. When you're doing experimental science, whether it's in physics or psychology or medicine, you have to be very, very careful as you're working with this sample, that the sample has to be a representative sample of the population. If you do an experiment on a sample and the sample is not representative of the entire population, you cannot generalize the results of your experiment. You're going to lead to totally wrong conclusions. And the same thing is true of these encounters. So very, very often, somebody has an encounter with a Jew or a Catholic or an African American, or a Hindu or whatever it is, and you generalize from that one encounter to everybody who is Jewish or everybody who's Hindu or everybody who's Protestant. So that's the second kind of one, that we generalize from an individual to an entire class of people. Now, it's interesting that phobias, happen in the same way. That phobias very often are the generalization of a specific event to all of life. I'm thinking of two examples. I remember watching on America's Funniest Home Videos at one stage, a scene where a father is taking a video of his little daughter, and she looks like she's maybe 2.5 years old. And they're walking side by side, and there's a wooden fence over to their right, and it's wooden slats, upright vertical slats, and there's maybe an inch difference between the contiguous pieces of board. And there's a beautiful flower, a daffodil, growing at this side, and the little daughter is fascinated, and she releases her daddy's hand, and she runs over, and she bends down, and she puts her nose to the flower in order to smell it. And right at that moment, at the other side of the fence, the little girl can't see it, or the father can't see it, there's this big dog, and the dog rushes at the fence and goes, "Row, row, 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 row," and the kid freaks out. Now, I guarantee you, I don't know why they thought this was funny. It's not funny, because I can guarantee you, for the rest of her life, that little child, whenever she sees flowers or smells flowers, she's going to be traumatized. She's going to re-traumatize herself because she's going to associate the smelling of the flower with a terrible fright that she got from the dog. So we generalize from a specific event, and now flowers are, out of bounds for that kid for the rest of her life. I'm thinking of an episode for myself. I was about 4 years old, and we went to the circus, and there are these rides, this big, big wheel. And for the first time in my life, I saw candy floss. And my grandmother bought me a stick of candy floss. Do you guys have that here? Do you know the big, big, fluffy candy floss? It's real sickly sweet. So I ate the candy floss, and then I went on this big, big wheel, this ride. And I puked all over the whole thing. For the rest of my life, until today, literally, the sight of candy floss, or somebody mentioning the word candy floss, I get a gag reflex. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to see it, and I certainly don't want to taste it. So once we associate, a stimulus and a response, it is very, very, very difficult to uncouple them. And the same thing then becomes true of prejudices. It becomes very difficult to uncouple prejudices for the stimulus from the response, either because I've been indoctrinated by my family or my society, or else I've generalized from one encounter to everything else. Now, all prejudices then, whether they're taught by the family or individual, have to do with projection, where as an individual or as a community or as a nation or even as a species, we project some of our own shadow material onto somebody else. When we do this as individuals, it creates all kinds of interpersonal problems. If I am not dealing with my own shadow material, and I can see in you very clearly stuff I can't see in myself, but it's there, I'm going to blame you, for the difficulties in our relationship. The same thing is true between communities. When a community doesn't recognize its own shadow material, it's going to dump it on another community. And my most egregious example of this was years and years and years ago, watching the movie Mississippi Burning. Any of you guys see that movie? And it's a movie about, trying to register African-American voters in the South during the civil rights in the 1960s. And I remember one stage of it, there is a white mother with nursing a baby at her breast, and she's been interviewed, about what's happening in the South. And she's, it's all them bloody blacks, isn't it? I mean, if we didn't keep them underfoot, they'd be burning our churches and raping our women, which is precisely what the white community was doing to the black community at the time. So this woman was projecting all of the shadow material of her own culture onto the black community and then oppressing them as a result. So it comes from projections. When we don't recognize our own shadow material as individuals or as communities or as a nation or even as a species, when we don't work with our shadow material as a species, we dump it onto nature and then we exploit and destroy nature. So it becomes really, really important that we retroject, because once we project, we begin to see very clearly out there what's actually inside in ourselves. I've shared this story with you a few times before. When we were small kids, I was still living with my grandparents. There was a movie theatre in Cork City called the Lido. And lest you think that the Lido was this luxurious Italian plushy seats, movie theatre, it was a big barn of a building with wooden seats, and the screen was a whitewashed concrete wall. And the price of admission on Saturday mornings, there was a special matinee performance of cowboy movies and Tarzan movies for children. And the price of admission was 2 clean milk bottles. Milk was delivered in bottles, and you'd wash out the bottles, and if you gave 2 milk bottles, that was the price of admission to the movies. And as we went to the movies, we'd fill up our pockets with stones. And we'd be sitting on the bench, watching the movie, and when the bad guy would come on screen, we'd start shouting advice to the hero who didn't see the bad guy creeping up in him. Watch out behind you! And of course, the good guy never paid attention. So we take out the stones and we start pelting the screen, pelting the bad guy, trying to get him. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, the movie would stop and the house lights would come on and a big burly steward would come in and just randomly pick out 1 or 2 kids and fire their asses out of the cinema. And then the movie would start up again and we'd be very, very quiet for 3 or 4 minutes until next time the baddie was creeping up on the good guy, and now would come the stones and we'd throw them again. Now we do that constantly. We do it as individuals, we do it as communities, we do it as nations, and we do it even as a species. We project our shadow material, the stuff we haven't worked on ourselves, onto somebody else or some other group, and then we take out the stones and we fire them at it. Which brings me to my 5th final point. The whole notion of feedback. The feedback loop that allows us to grow and to learn. The 2 most important ingredients of learning, I believe, are feedback and repetition. We learn stuff by doing it again and again and again. You learned how to drive a car, not because you read it in a book and went out and drove the car, but because you got into the car again and again and again and again. And finally, after months and months and months, you were comfortable driving the car. So we learn everything by repetition and by the feedback, doing stuff and then figure out whether or not it worked. And there are 3 kinds of feedback. The first kind of feedback is what I would call unsolicited feedback. People who give you feedback whether you want to hear it or not. There are always people in our lives who feel like it's my job to tell you what you're doing wrong. And I never get it that, diplomacy and compassion are even more important than truth telling. And so I feel like it's incumbent upon me to point out to you the crap that you were doing, and as abruptly as I can, without any compassion or any truth. But if there's some element of truth in it, I can grow. Once I get beyond the insult, of your telling me in such a barbaric fashion what I'm doing wrong, maybe there's some merit to what you're saying. And particularly if I tend to get the same kind of feedback from several different sources, then probably there's a grain of truth in it, even if it's been wildly exaggerated. So that'd be the first kind of feedback, unsolicited. The second kind of feedback would be solicited feedback, whereas you have a very close friend whom you regard as a wise person, or you have a spiritual director, or you have a therapist, and regularly you say to this person, how am I doing? Here's what happened in such and such a situation. Can you advise me here? What did I do wrong? Or how do you think I can grow? And so you're asking for guidance from somebody, whose wisdom you trust. That would be a solicited, a feedback. And then the third kind, I would call it self-generated feedback, where you begin to look at your own performance and begin, to figure out, can I do things better? Now, I think this is the real purpose of Lent, and particularly dealing with prejudices, examining prejudices. So when I said to the congregation in Lent of 1988, it's more important than giving up sugar or candies or cigarettes or alcohol or whatever. Give up a prejudice. What would that look like? It would mean really sitting down during this Lent and figuring out, am I aware of some prejudice in my life, that something that makes me angry or anxious on a regular basis? What is it? So the first thing would be to identify what makes me angry on a regular basis. Having identified it, I then need to study this prejudice and see, am I justified in holding this position? Are there data there to support that position? The third thing then would be, can I imagine myself being in the other's boots? Imagine I came through the same system, the same family, the same education, the same socioeconomic status, whatever. How would I be if I had come through that system? To really try to imagine it. The fourth step would be then to forgive the other person. There's a great French proverb that says, to understand everything is to forgive everything. If you really understand why another person is doing what they're doing, if you really understand it, you'll see reasons why it's that way. And you're able to forgive them. Where we don't have the freedom to be who we want to be, we're being fashioned by society and by family. And then the fifth piece is to transform myself as a result of what I have just learned. So again, I offer this to our congregation, 31 years later. Maybe the most important thing that you and I can do this Lent is not to give up beer or alcohol or cookies. It is to give up a prejudice and transform ourselves in the process. Namaste.